My name is Andrew Hunter Scholey, and today we are covering My Winnipeg, released in 2007, directed by Guy Maddin, screenplay by Guy Maddin, and George Toll. And to join me today for My Winnipeg, once again, we have Spencer Allen Trout. Spencer, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So, Spencer is on this episode for a couple of reasons. Number one, yet again, the output of the show has been a little bit sporadic. One of the reasons is that we have been experimenting and working on new recording setups in order to have guests and, you know, have the show sound as good as possible, recording in our kitchen, which is where we are right now. So we decided to just do one together instead of taking the time to get a guest in or over the phone in these quarantine times. Yeah, so with this new recording setup, we decided that, you know, we would just have one with the two of us so we wouldn't be wasting anyone's time in case and the whole recording didn't turn out for whatever reason.
Like the last one.
Yeah, exactly. Seems to be a par for the course with this show sometimes. Yeah, so this episode is kind of another gimme. I thought it would be fitting if I was going to be doing an episode with Spencer to do My Winnipeg. Because, Spencer, you are a Winnipegger. Is that the term?
Yes.
There we go. Just pull that one out of the air.
Yeah.
I don't think at this point there's any need to introduce you at all.
No, go back and listen to the other episodes if you want to get my story.
Yeah, there you go. It's pretty well covered. There's a lot out there on My Winnipeg. I often comment on the show when I'm recording even relatively popular films that there's really little out there in terms of information about, you know, the production of the film, you know, thought pieces on the film. It seems Canadian cinema, we just don't seem to do deep dives into our own movies too much. But there's a lot out there on My Winnipeg. I mean, I didn't even have to go onto the internet to do any of my research. I have books on Guy Maddin. I have a book specifically on My Winnipeg. There's even a Criterion DVD of it out there. There's an exhaustive amount of information on this film. So I figured instead of kind of doing a beat-by-beat deep dive into the film, I would get someone from Winnipeg to talk about it. Because, let's be honest, not a lot of people have been to Winnipeg.
No, that's fair. A lot of people have been through Winnipeg, but not many people go there to visit and stay and take in the sights, right? So
yeah, I mean, I've been through Winnipeg twice, stopped there once. Mm-hmm. You know, the first time I drove across the country, I kind of went around Winnipeg and caught some of the main sites, saw the Golden Boy,
yeah, you
know, stuff like that. So, Spencer, you had never seen My Winnipeg before?
No, not until I watched it for this.
You are familiar with the works of Guy Maddin.
I am, yes. I think Twilight of the Ice Nymphs was actually the first feature-length film of his that I saw.
Okay. So, for the sake of the audience, what is My Winnipeg?
It's someone who lived in Winnipeg making a film about Winnipeg. I mean, the title's very apt. It is Guy Maddin's Winnipeg. It's how he envisions Winnipeg and kind of artistically diving into Winnipeg, as it were. It's part documentary, but it's I believe he refers to it as a docu-fantasia, and it's kind of
exactly, yeah, kind of a pieced together patchwork. He himself said that he had the idea of using completely disparate objects and combining them to create a subconscious product and to create an irreconcilable effect for it.
It is definitely a love letter of sorts to a city that doesn't get a lot of love.
Now, I said we weren't going to do a deep dive, but I mean, I think we need to do a little bit of background for the film just in case somebody might be listening to this who hasn't seen it before. Guy Maddin, native Winnipegger. Really, I mean, this is not to disparage any of the other films that we've covered on this podcast or, you know, play favorites, but this is really the first huge Canadian film we've covered on the show. Like the first big name director, known all over the world. His works are all known. Like I said, there's a Criterion disc of this and many of his other films. Yeah, so this is the first time we're covering like one of the big name directors of Canada. You know, an iconic film almost by this point. I mean, it's been around for over 10 years.
Well, it is. It's a big film. It was all over the place when it came out. You know, it made top 10 lists of almost every major movie critic when it came out.
And, you know, you even get it now when people are making, you know, top 10 lists of, you know, the movies post the year 2000, you know, it quite often goes on there. Madden was born in Winnipeg in 1957. He actually started out as a student of economics at the University of Manitoba, and later was a photo archivist, which obviously lent itself well to this. Yeah, famously was a house painter for a while. He didn't really get into making films until his 30s, which is kind of inspirational unto itself. And I mean, obviously, I mean, how would you describe the films of Guy Maddin?
He takes a lot of aesthetic choices from silent films. Like even his color works look like they're kind of saturated in color. Like when you go back and they colorized a bunch of black and white films once color became a thing. It still has that aesthetic to it. He's very big on that, and maybe not being like not like a Heart of the World type where it's very, very blatant silent film, but he has this kind of there's a lot in the editing there, you know, like it's more like you can definitely tell it's a very artsy film in that regard. A lot of interspersed cuts and a lot of like even like dialogue cards, despite the fact that there is dialogue in the film itself, right?
Yeah, you know, a lot of that look of movies from the 20s, a lot of European films. I mean, anyone who knows anything about Guy Maddin, I mean, he got into films because he started hanging out with some neighborhood people who worked at the University of Manitoba, and they would take out movies, you know, like millimeter print films from the university and just screen them in their living rooms. And that was his first exposure to a lot of this sort of cinema that influenced his later works. And a lot of times they were copies of copies and, you know, really, really shitty prints. So he kind of, it's funny that the sort of aesthetic quite often that he translates over isn't necessarily exactly the films of the time, but shitty prints of the films of the times.
Absolutely.
Have you seen many of his works now?
Oh, I've seen a handful, maybe about 5.
Yeah. He's definitely acquired taste, but once you get on the right wavelength, you really dig him.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not it. There's this kind of it's funny because for someone who, to my understanding, didn't have a background in theater, a lot of his stuff is staged like it's theater. A lot of his films.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even if you watch some documentaries on him, you take a look at the sets built in these sort of warehouses of Winnipeg, because quite famously, his productions all take place in Winnipeg, using Winnipeg actors for the most part. There was that brief blip right around just before Making My Winnipeg that there was a lot of attention, a lot of Hollywood stars, famously like Isabella Rossellini, international people wanted to be on the films, and then it's almost like he got big enough, and again, he's not huge, like you have to pretty much be a film person to know who Guy Maddin is, but being this quiet guy from Winnipeg, you could tell that he got kind of uncomfortable with the amount of acclaim and stuff like that, and his productions kind of shrunk down a lot afterwards and went back to that whole, you know, shooting films with local people and talent. So just really quickly about My Winnipeg, as stated in the opening, released in 2007. It was originally commissioned by the Documentary Channel. So this was not an original idea of Maddin's, unlike most of his work. Originally titled Love Me, Love My Winnipeg, he was approached just to make a film. It was either going to be, he was told that the president, Michael Burns, who was the president of the Documentary Channel at the time, said that, you know, I want you to make a documentary on either trains or Winnipeg. And Guy Maddin has mused afterwards that he thinks that is probably because he at one point took a train through Winnipeg. The producer said to Maddin, what I want you to do is make it your Winnipeg, enchant me. And then his other piece of advice was, don't give the frozen hellhole everyone knows that Winnipeg is.
And he still manages to pull off the fact that Winnipeg's a frozen hellhole, and completely disregards the fact that right now, or at least in a month or two, it will be a sweltering hellhole, which is the two extremes of Winnipeg.
So just to cover just a couple more bits of the basics. Shot for $500,000. Guy Maddin originally declined doing the documentary just because of the amount of work involved, in terms of research, archival film, He just basically thought that it would just be too much effort to make. And then from what I could gather a little bit later, he needed some money. So he approached and wanted to see if they would still be willing to back the film, of which they agreed. And then he went out. A lot of the influences, he was trying to think of how to approach it. He started talking to his friends, and his friends would tell him like sort of half-remembered facts or kind of things that they assumed were true about the city. And that's where he started to get the idea for the tone of the film. What ends up being what he calls 1/3 myth, 1/3 wishful thinking, and 1/3 factoid for the film. Guy Maddin wrote the screenplay. One thing I did not know about his process is that a lot of his screenplays are written with George Toll. So Maddin kind of comes up with the basic structure of the film and what goes on, and Toll does the pats, and apparently the very unique Guy Maddin dialogue actually comes from George Toll. Because much like films like, David Mamet or David Lynch, you can spot Guy Maddin dialogue a mile away. Mm-hmm. So that kind of goes over the basics of it. I can kind of toss my notes aside now because, as I said, I wanted this to be more the point of view of someone discovering this movie from Winnipeg and what it says to them. So Spencer, just right off the bat, I mean, when were you first aware of Guy Maddin as somebody born, bred, raised in Winnipeg?
I grew up involved in theater, and you just knew him from like an acting kind of dramatic arts point of view. You just knew who Guy Maddin was. He's the biggest guy in Winnipeg with regards to that sort of thing. I mean, as a filmmaker, no one else comes close to him from Winnipeg.
Yeah, he is kind of the...
He's the guy, It's like we'll never escape the Guess Who. We'll never escape Guy Maddin. That's kind of our legacy right there.
Now, you being a theater guy, though, like, was Guy Maddin known outside of theater circles? Like, obviously, on a national level, he was the person picked to make the documentary on Winnipeg that was commissioned. But, if you aren't into theater and you aren't into film, is he a known commodity in Winnipeg?
As a result of this film, absolutely. I mean, when this came out, it was everywhere. It was on every newspaper and every newsstand in Winnipeg.
And yet you managed to not see it.
That's just me. Things are hit and miss with me when it comes to seeing films. For whatever reason, I never saw it, despite the fact that my best friend and his brother are in it.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. I remember we sat down and watched it together, and you were quite bemused seeing your friend on film.
Yeah, because I knew him. I've been friends with Wesley Cade for 20 years. I mean,
and Wesley Cade plays
his older brother, and Wesley's younger brother, Brandon Cade, plays his other brother, who, as it turned out, killed himself. I'm sure we'll touch on that later, talk about the family dynamic.
The character that he portrays killed himself. Because we're not going to do a beat by beat, but one of the centerpieces of the film is that Guy Maddin, in an attempt to finally, quote unquote, escape Winnipeg, decides that he's going to do reenactments of his childhood with his mother, and his mother, quote unquote. There's a lot of this sort of multi-level stuff going on in this movie. Anne Savage, who is fantastic in this, and if you don't know who Anne Savage is, look up a movie, film noir called Detour, which is not only one of my favorite noir films, but one of my favorite movies of all time. That's kind of what she was best known for. And Guy Maddin picked her, kind of pulled her out of obscurity to portray his mother in the film. In the film, it is supposed to be his factual mother, not an actress playing his mother. So he gets her, he goes to the old family home, which we'll probably talk a little bit more about, and stages these sort of reenactments. So your two friends play the two actors playing his brothers in the recreations in the film.
Yes.
And it is the character of the brother that your friend is playing. He is the person who committed suicide, not that your friend committed suicide.
No, not that my friend's brother, Brandon Cade, killed himself. He's still alive. I saw him Christmas before last, but yes. Yeah. Okay,
so let's just go right off the bat. What are your impressions of this? What did it feel like to you being a Winnipegger, seeing something like this portrayed about your city?
Well, it's funny. I think there are some things that jump out at me, like talking about the old arena and what that kind of meant to him. I don't care for hockey. I'm the first person to admit it, but I remember the old arena. I remember when it was demolished. My parents met at the old arena. Like, that's a big part of my life, whether I want it to be or not.
Well, it's kind of like me being from Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens.
Yes.
You know, when they decided to move the hockey to the Air Canada Centre and gut the old building. I mean, I think the facade is still there. But, you know, these kind of hallowed old institutions. And that's kind of a big takeaway of this film. I mean, as you said, this is Guy Madden's Winnipeg. You know, one thing that kind of crossed my brain a lot, you know, like we both live in Halifax now. We're both transplants. You know, and I kind of toyed with the idea of what would my Toronto be? What would my Halifax be? You know, obviously, like if I did in my Halifax, you know, a chunk of it would be about the local comic scene because that's what's important to me.
Yeah, right.
You know, and you know, to a lot of other people, they wouldn't give an F. And but that's what I think is great about this film and the sort of docufantasia effect. You know, the sort of hypnotic quality. I mean, the movie opens with, it opens with line readings with Anne Savage portraying the mother. So immediately setting up this idea of this sort of artifice that you're not seeing a real documentary because you're seeing an actor doing line readings with Guy Madden coaching or doing these lines over and over and over again. We're seeing that happens later in the film. But the film opens up with, you know, a very Guy Madden-y mantra of Guy Madden doing these voiceovers of trying to escape Winnipeg while you have this rocking train that, you know, seemingly will never actually leave Winnipeg. So right off the bat, there's a sort of idea that Winnipeg is a place to escape, at least for Guy Madden, even though famously he, you know, hates leaving Winnipeg. He hates traveling. That's, you know, still why all of his stuff is filmed in Winnipeg. What do you think of that take of it? Like, were you somebody that couldn't wait to get out of there?
Well, I mean, I waited long enough. I did leave. I haven't lived in Winnipeg now for, well, going on 10 years. But it's funny because it's always like home is home. Where you come from very much so makes a part of you, especially in my case where, you know, I lived there for 25 years. You know, I was born there. Even I can't really escape kind of the mentality of Winnipeg as such. I mean, everything that's in that film, true or false, is all still kind of part of Winnipeg.
Yeah,
and I definitely get that. I definitely carry around that kind of. And as someone who's interested in history, especially history of places that I've been, like Winnipeg, it was interesting to watch and be like true, false, right?
Yeah, I remember when I first saw it, like I saw it when it came out. I want to say that it was opening weekend. I saw it as soon as I could anyways, because I had just gotten into Guy Madden around the time that this movie was released. I mean, I think I got into Guy Madden with Saddest Music of the World because I was living in Toronto at the time, and, you know, there were a lot of art house cinemas. So, you know, these movies did get buzzed about. But I was living in Victoria by the time my Winnipeg came out, and I really didn't know too much about it going in. But I remember immediately after leaving, going back to my place on Government Street and just looking up as many facts as I could about Winnipeg. Like, is it really the sleepwalking capital of the country? You know, the famous horse head scene of all the now iconic shot of all the horse heads frozen in the river after the stable fire. And just kind of like looking up and just being like, okay, this is true. And sometimes being surprised by what was true, you know,
absolutely,
and what isn't. And walking that fine line of memory. The other thing, and I mean, this is a movie that you can talk about on a lot of different levels. And there's so many different little film snippets, like little bits and, you know, like he said, like little tidbits here and there, that every time I watch it, there are bits that I always forget about. Like I always forget about the part about the bridge. That was originally supposed to go across the Nile, but it was like the wrong size. So Winnipeggers ever looking for a bargain decide that they're going to buy it and put it in Winnipeg. I forget about these things. And then there are parts that are just absolutely ingrained in my brain. The one thing that really interests me about it as well, when you talk about the sense of history, and, you know, history is also memory, and memory can sometimes be false. And the thing that you brought up about home, that in this movie, home isn't even necessarily a place, it's a time. Mm-hmm. You know, like, I consider my home to be Toronto in the 90s.
Right.
You know, that Toronto is not there anymore. It's been a lot more gentrified. A lot of places that I used to like to go are literally gone and replaced by condos now. Right. So I don't feel like I would be going home if I went back to Toronto. And that's what Guy Maddin really goes into here, you know, that it's specifically the Winnipeg of his childhood, his memories of his family, that, you know, home is also can be a time and not just a physical place that you go to, and playing with concepts of memory and how that plays into it.
Right, and I think that plays into his sleepwalking capital. Like, that's the thing, is that everything has a half-truth in this film, even the most outrageous claims, such as that.
Which is one of my favorite parts of the film. Like, that's one part that always... Like, I think the loveliest bit of fiction in this film is the whole thing of, as they stated, that, you know, it's a sleepwalking capital of the world, and there's a law in place that if somebody is sleepwalking and they end up at an old residence, the owners of the residence have to take them in and make sure they're comfortable.
Yeah.
I just love that as a concept.
Well, and I think the whole sleepwalking thing is true about Winnipeg. I think it's true about a lot of places, is that people just kind of live their life on autopilot. And I know that's certainly true for a lot of people in Winnipeg. They'll never leave Winnipeg.
Yeah.
Right? They don't even necessarily think to. It's sleepwalking. They just get up every day and they kind of go about their business. Winnipeg's terribly isolated in that sense. You can't really go anywhere. Where do you go?
Do you think that's part of it? Do you think that there's sort of psychological wall of isolation? As he says in the intro, the beginning of the movie, like, it's at the heart of the continent, like right in the middle. Do you think that has something to do with the idea of people not leaving Winnipeg? I mean, I can say that about where I'm from. Like, I say I'm from Toronto, but technically I'm from Brampton. And, you know, I always say that there are two types of people in Brampton. You know, those that can't get out of there fast enough, and those that just put down roots and stay there forever. Whichever way may be, you know, whatever floats your boat. There's not a good or a bad way to look at it. But, like, with Winnipeg, like I say with Brampton, that is because it's the suburbs. And either you're a suburbs person or you're not. But, like, with Winnipeg, do you think that isolation has something to do with the sleepwalkness, the not leaving aspect of it?
Absolutely. It's never really been hit hard by, well, since the Great Depression, it's never been really, the economy there has never been so bad. Like, someplace like out here, for example, or like Newfoundland in the 90s is a great example, where the entire economy just kind of bottoms out and people go elsewhere. That never really happened in Winnipeg. There's always been work there of some kind, right? Because,
as they say in the film, it's this huge hub. Like, the rail system, I think the rail facts that he quotes in there is one of the few truths.
Well, it's funny because Winnipeg, a huge part of its population is Scottish and Slavic, both of which are notoriously cheap cultures, for lack of a better term, notoriously tight-fisted, and that comes into the Winnipeggers' love of bargain. That's true. Anytime that they want to roll out something new in retail, at least for two major retail companies that I worked for, they would roll it out in Winnipeg as one of the places they would test that, because it's true. Winnipeggers love a bargain. And that's the thing. That's a truth in a bit that is otherwise BS, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's the old Winnipeg saying, "The bullshit baffles brains," you know, and Guy Maddin really plays that up, because he's not 100% wrong. Very rarely is he 100% right, but there's such subjective truth in a lot of what he says, and that's what makes this movie fascinating.
Well, that's why I wanted to get somebody from Winnipeg here. Like, when he was producing, I read in a couple of places that, you know, he wanted to make a film about Winnipeg, like when he was growing up, and there would be a movie that takes place in New York or takes place in San Francisco. These cities that kind of have a cinematic reputation that, for someone like me, like, I've been to New York, but I'll be honest, I haven't been to New York in probably over 20 years. You know, my impression of New York, Manhattan proper, is, you know, still from movies and TV. Or even if they don't take place there, like, a lot of people are familiar with what Vancouver looks like just because of the amount of TV shows shot there. So he wanted to give this sort of impressionistic quality to Winnipeg. And do you think he nailed it? Or got close? Like, do you think somebody like the many, however many people have seen this movie and haven't been to Winnipeg, do you think that they get an accurate impression, at least, of Winnipeg?
Well, no, simply because every other city that you mentioned there's some kind of coding for it. How did you know that Full House took place in San Francisco? They didn't have to say it. The first shot is of the Golden Gate Bridge, like every time for the opening credits, right?
I was just going to say, I before this moment did not know that Full House took place in San Francisco.
But if you watch the intro credits, it's like it's like, how did you know that like Seinfeld's coded New York?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like there's a code that you can use to be like, Seinfeld would never have to say this takes place in New York City, because it's obvious it takes place in New York City.
Whenever I see a picture of a New York diner, I get the Seinfeld just run through my head.
It seems almost kind of sad that when Winnipeg is portrayed in film, in Canadian film as well, I can only think of it ever being portrayed in Canadian film, but it is that frozen hellhole.
Well, this is a funny thing about Winnipeg. You get Winnipeg as sort of like a butt of a joke.
Yes.
Like I'm thinking of that, kind of for Canadians famous Simpsons line, and I don't even remember the episode, but there's a family in the car, and it's like the kids are acting up, and he's like,
"Don't stop arguing. There's going to be no Cape Canaveral for anyone, right?" And
and he says, "If you don't stop right now, we're turning this car back around and heading back to Winnipeg."
Yeah. And then he gets slapped on the back of the head by Nelson. It's like, that's it, back to Winnipeg. Yeah. Well, no, but I think in like Hardcore Logo, for some reason they get to Winnipeg and it's a blizzard. And
yeah, because that's the farthest part of their tour. They're touring
Yes.
like from Winnipeg to Vancouver for the benefit show.
And
God, I want to cover Hardcore Logo on the show.
in my Winnipeg, it's the same. Like most of the outdoor scenes are all snowy, and it's like, yes, but again, there's so much of Winnipeg that isn't that. The only time that there's not snow on the ground is in historical footage, right? And that's a huge part of Winnipeg. No one could live somewhere where it's that miserable all the time. Even like you couldn't.
Well, it's kind of a funny, weird obsession of his. Like, I'm pretty sure the first movie of his that I saw was Saddest Music of the World, and I remember first watching it, and when you're watching it, it as well takes place in the snowscape, and it's a film of his, one of his few films that actually take place in quote unquote Winnipeg, and not some sort of far off European town or something like that. And everybody's getting around by these subterranean sort of tubes. It's like they're like submarines that they get in with the hatch in the top, and it just kind of travels through the snow. And it wasn't until halfway through the film that I realized that they're streetcars, and the snow is so high on either side, like they don't draw attention to it. So it seems like an aspect that Guy Maddin really kind of leans into. Like, are you disappointed that he leans so heavily? Because, like, my big takeaway of this film is that it does still lean heavily into cliches, right? It does have, the center heart piece of the entire film is about the arena being destroyed and about how the Winnipeg Jets were taken away. And, I kind of cringe a little bit when I think about an international audience seeing a Canadian film and we're still going on about hockey in some way, shape, or form.
Well, I think I don't want to say that relying on like Winnipeg is lazy, but I mean it kind of is, but it's also something you have to deal with when you're talking about the city. For my money, the most interesting stuff is the stuff that goes on at the Ledge, because the Legislative Building is another building that I had a fascination with it when I was a child, and I still do.
Describe how it's used in here and what the Legislative Building is.
Well, Legislative Building is where the Manitoba legislative body meets. So it is like the true provincial capital. That's why Winnipeg is the provincial capital. It has it. Our MLAs meet there. It's surrounded in kind of the shroud of mystery because there are some very unique artistic choices made and aesthetic choices when they built the Legislative Building, which was made about 110 years ago. And it was, begun, and it finished after the First World War. There's a Black Star pool in it, which is a 9-pointed star in marble, and there's sphinxes, and there's all kinds of...
Which Guy Maddin is quick to draw attention to. He maintains that it was built by Masons.
Yes, which I mean, like, by definition, any stone building was made by Masons.
No, but yes, Masonic Lodge, yeah.
And yeah, there's definitely that kind of interest in that building. Like I said, my father worked there. He worked for the phone systems and had contract there. So as a teenager, just before my father retired, he took me through the whole building because he had the master key for it.
That'd be cool.
So, no, it was fantastic. It's a very unique building, and they bring in things like Viscount Gordon and all these kind of historical characters, and the idea that there was a big kind of paranormal scene there when it comes to things like seances and contacting the dead and the paranormal. Even now, Chris Rutowski, who's one of the premier Canadian ufologists, is an assistant professor or a professor at the University of Manitoba, and he's like the Canadian authority on UFOs, right? Like there's this weird kind of supernatural inkling to Manitoba as well.
Well, and they go into that at the beginning of the film. The beginning of the film, it's funny, we also watched this movie with our friend Tessa. The beginning of the film, like I said, is very meditative, and then he starts going on about the three rivers. What are they?
Well, it's two rivers, but it's the Red and the Assiniboine meet at the Forks.
At the Forks, okay.
But it's like the Assiniboine merges into the Red, and then north of there it's the Red.
Which leads to the very beginnings of Winnipeg, that it was a meeting place for the indigenous population because of these rivers meeting for trade. And in the movie itself kind of meditates on that and the sort of spiritual, almost psychic energy that kind of comes from it, rivers, comparing it to a woman's lap.
Yes.
And the cycle of birth. Like, it's really easy to sound conceited talking about this film at points. And it's funny because Tessa, who had no idea what she was getting into, she was just along for the ride, whatever we were watching, and afterwards stated that she was really relieved that the movie kind of shifts from that, because it goes on for a while. Like the first 10-15 minutes of this film is this sort of meditative mantra about the spiritual energies and stuff like that. Yeah, I just remember her commenting that she was very relieved that, she was like, is it going to be an hour and a half of this?
Well, I think that's just kind of that I'm glad that all that stuff is in there, because it's reflective of Winnipeg.
Yeah.
That there is this weird kind of metaphysical context to everything.
And sorry, we're kind of getting around what we were talking about, but like this revolves around the seance scene, which is actually one of my favorite scenes of the movie, because it incorporates this is the seance scene is like the Guy Madden greatest hits.
Yes,
part of the movie, pulling in all these sort of different elements that he's used, even having a ballet dancer in there, which is a reference to his work with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet and his work with them with pages from a Virgin's Diary, the Winnipeg Ballet's version of Dracula.
Oh, you know what? And I just realized that he obviously had permission to film in the legislative building, in the ledge, because that's the ledge. Those are the bison. That's the staircase. That's all the limestone and marble in there. That's legit. Whereas I think of other on-scene footage in the film, it's all like handycam footage, because he's apparently found unique ways to acquire footage of things like the arena before it was completely demolished, and even the paddle wheel scene, like the paddle wheel restaurant in the Bay building, of that all looks like handycam footage. And I just wonder if that's indicative that he didn't necessarily have permission to film there.
Well, I don't have the actual list on me, but there are at least 7 or 8 different sort of film mediums that he shot in, on film, on video, on phone, some of the grainy footage and stuff like that. And it's just all cobbled together, which again, it leads to a very interesting patchwork.
Yes.
Quality in the film, and kind of throws what is archival footage that you're watching, what is recreations. Apparently the actual archival footage is very minimal. Yeah. In there.
Well, it was interesting that you said that a lot of the If Day scenes aren't archival, which is really interesting to me, because apparently Fox Media owns them.
Yeah, it did get some international attention, and the only actual footage he could find, and they were charging an astronomical amount to use the footage, so he ended up only getting 20 seconds of actual footage.
Yeah.
And kind of recreating. But that's the whole thing, the impressionistic nature of the film. One of my favorite parts of the film is when they go into the riots
Yes. The Winnipeg General Strike.
The Winnipeg General Strike, and he incorporates animation in there.
Yes.
And these sort of impressionistic. Got to stop saying impressionistic. Again, slamming these mediums up, and we're making this sound rather arty and dour, but it's also a really funny film.
It is.
It has like Guy Madden always has a certain element of comedy to it, almost like a Lynch film.
One of the funniest lines in Canadian cinema, right? Which is, "Mom, get up and make us meatloaf." That kills me. When I heard that, I absolutely died. That's hilarious.
Okay, well, let's get into this again, because it's hypothetical that somebody would be listening to this that has not seen the film. The film at the centerpiece, it has all these sort of bits and bobs. Some of them we may get to, but the two main centerpieces of the film are, as we touched about, the destruction of the Winnipeg Arena. The Bay Building is the one that's still up. The Edens.
Yeah, the Edens building, where my dad also worked. Yeah,
so the destruction of the Edens building, and basically
to make the new arena, because the new arena, the MTS Center, is where the Edens building was.
And what was the other thing that gets destroyed in the film? I'm blanking. But there's that whole part, and that's the part that kind of, at least the arena.
Oh, Happy Land.
Oh, Happy Land.
Yeah,
at least the arena. Well, we should talk about Happy Land because Happy Land is weird. But anyways, the two big center points: the destruction of the arena, and really his relationship with his father. It's the only time that he really goes into his father at all, who died when I think he was like in his 20s. But apparently
had at university.
But had a somewhat strained relationship with. And then these home recreations that involve his mother. So you have both the male and the female influence, because the mother side of it, the mother being very domineering over the family, at least the way that she is portrayed in this. Yes. They got Anne Savage, for God's sake, who made film noir femme fatales look like pussycats in Detour. These recreations also go into the family home where they grew up, which was, they lived on top of a beauty salon. It was this large, blocky white house.
Yeah, it was at Lil's at 800 Ellis Avenue.
And do you know where that is?
It's Thames Taylor now, which is funny because he shows just a flash of it on screen. I'm like, hey, I know that building. Whether or not he actually lived there is one thing, but that's what's at 800 Ellis. I
think he did, because
I would believe, but anything else in this film, I'd believe it.
Because when I was doing research for this film, one of the things that I watched was around the time of Twilight of the Ice Nymphs, when that was still in production, a documentary narrated by Tom Waits was filmed about Guy Madden, and a lot of it revolves around Twilight of the Ice Nymphs,
right.
But they also, go back and do a career retrospective up until that point.
Right.
And it's a really interesting watch and a snapshot of Guy Madden at that time and what he was going through, because he's basically sitting there on Twilight of the Ice Nymphs, which was a very, if you know Guy Madden, famously a very troubled production after not getting quite a few projects off the ground, after getting, this sort of attention. And, and there's, Shelley Duvall and Hollywood types in there, so he's not working with the same people. And anyways, he describes his childhood home, and it's a Lego reconstruction of it, which of course is used in my Winnipeg. I had never put two and two together. I just thought it was a clever way for him to show the house with this Lego prop of what the house looked like. But he had it back in, what was Ice Nymphs, 97?
Yeah, it was mid to late 90s.
He had it back then. It was something he had lying around. So unless he's like one of these people that is constantly making stuff up, I imagine that he did indeed live above a hair salon. The book that I have on my Winnipeg actually has like archival photos of, what is it, Lil's? Yes. Hair salon? But to go back to the whole thing about the masculine and the feminine, like they dwell a long time about this and the sort of female influence of like, being around these middle-aged women and going to school smelling of like hair product and hairspray, and the sort of effect of that, and this sort of obsession with, like, you could see like struggling with his attractions to women, both these old women, his relationship with his mother, and also rather creepily, fetishistically looking at the girls from the, what is it, Catholic Schoolgirl Academy?
Yeah, St. Mary's.
St. Mary's.
Academy, yeah.
So that's really the heart of the film, is these two parts. So the recreations are fascinating because they take, there are three of them scattered throughout the entire movie, and they take very different tracks as to the relationship of the mother with the family. One of them are the lines that's being repeated at the beginning where she's convinced that the daughter, after hitting a deer with the car, really was having a sexual tryst. With someone from the track team or some random stranger that came to help her with the car. And just being absolutely horrible. The daughter saying, "You're nuts." And then the one that you referenced, which is the poor mother's tired lying in bed, and the children, two of which are your friends, berating her to get up and make them food because they're utterly incapable of making any food themselves.
Which, to note, Guy Madden himself as a young boy is not present here. It's only his siblings.
Yeah, he is not in the recreations.
Yes.
You could hypothetically say because he was quite a fair bit younger than his siblings, so maybe that's why he wouldn't have been as active in these things. Maybe because the camera is supposed to be him watching his family this way. And also the father is not in these recreations, and they note that his father had passed away. He thinks it would be creepy to get an actor, or upsetting to the mother to get an actor to play the father. So instead, as a compromise, they exhume his body and bury it in the middle of the living room underneath a couch. So underneath a blanket.
Yes.
Rug.
Yeah.
So through all these household recreations, this is one of those movies that if you haven't seen it or you don't know Guy Madden, it sounds like we're making it up.
Oh, yes.
But the father is underneath a rug. You see this mound, and when they're all watching TV, they're leaning up against the mound in the middle of the room. And again, on the multi-level of this, so not to upset the mother, but the mother is actually an actress. Like I said, many layers.
Yeah.
But that brings me to one of my favorite parts, which is in the first segment, which is Ledge Man. Yeah, so again, in this movie, the family's gathered watching TV, and it's claims that Ledge Man is the only daily drama filmed in Winnipeg.
Yes.
And Ledge Man is basically, I'm trying to think of how they describe it in the film. Every episode revolves around an overly sensitive main character who takes flight to something, goes out onto the ledge of his apartment building, threatening to jump,
yes,
and then has to be coaxed back in.
Yes.
And this is apparently a daily drama, and this is what every episode is about. Are Winnipeggers overly sensitive? Is that what he's saying? Which would be ironic because he is overly sensitive about a lot of things that he's talking about.
Well, no, I think the fact that it's a show that stars his mother, has his mother at the age that she's currently at in these flashbacks, I think it's more of him reflecting on himself.
Well, Ledge Man is played by the guy who plays quote-unquote Guy Madden
yes,
at the beginning of the film.
On the train.
And
yes.
I love how the mother was the actress in Ledge Man who plays the mother that starts out berating him on the ledge, but then gradually, says you were never a disappointment, talks him back in. But then he also says that his mother's sitting at home and never misses an episode. So that's as well playing into this whole sort of multi-layer meta. There's a lot of layers physically and figuratively.
Absolutely.
In this film with a lot of the sort of plots.
Well, I think that's the whole point of this film, is that part of it is kind of a catharsis, and it's a lot of kind of dealing with issues that you have. And by calling it My Winnipeg, you can kind of say it's about my city. Yeah. But really,
it's a map to his brain.
It's about Guy Madden. That's what it is. That's what this film is. It's Guy Madden looking hard at himself while looking at the city of Winnipeg.
Now, did any of this film resonate with you at all as a Winnipegger?
Oh yeah, certainly. Like I said, all the stuff about the old arena and about the ledge, about things that I could agree with.
Would you say the ledge? You mean the legislature, not the ledge that the ledge man stands on?
Yeah. No, that's what when the Winnipegger says, "Yeah, I'm going to the ledge," or it's like this is going down at the ledge. They mean the legislative building.
Yeah.
Even just small things like being dyslexic. I mean, most of my family's dyslexic to some extent.
And would you say that in context of the film?
Yeah, he could, because he was talking about how in his boyhood home his name was carved backwards into his door, so Santa would know where he lived.
Yeah,
he just mentions that in passing, and it's a small detail, but it's still a detail, right? Oh yeah, no, it definitely resounds with how much you want to leave Winnipeg, but you just can't. Like you said about home being a time and a place, and it is a time and a place. My home is Winnipeg, but the Winnipeg of 20 years ago, right? Yeah. And I get that. Guy Madden's never going to leave Winnipeg. He can't leave Winnipeg. He can confront it, but he's going to realize that he's kind of confronting himself, and that resonates with me, being an artist and someone who left Winnipeg. Yeah. You know.
Do you think the film gets a good sense of geography? Like you pointed out, knowing where the childhood home was.
Well, yeah, he can't. That's the thing. These are all real locations. Anything that he's kind of obtuse about as to where it's located, like the frozen horse heads. Well, yeah, okay, that makes sense because he's just pulling that out of his ass, as it were.
And just explain what that is, because it is one of the more striking moments of the film.
Yeah, he says there was a fire in a stable, and the horses plunged into the river and kind of froze in place there, with their heads sticking out, and like.
It became a sort of tourist attraction.
Lovers would go by and like go for a stroll amongst these horse heads, which is a great scene. That's one of the iconic scenes of the film. That's one that everyone knew about, right before ever seeing it.
Yeah, there's a collection of the screenplay with notes by Madden that I would love to get. I mean, I have numerous books about Guy Madden, but I've never tracked that one down. And the cover is beautiful. It's this sort of greenish cover, and it's just the silhouettes of the horse heads.
Yeah,
you know, like cut out paper. Yeah,
but everything like Happy Land, like the historic.
So Happy Land was a real thing.
It was a real thing. Yes, it was an amusement park
called Happy Land.
Called Happy Land, yes, which was on the north side of the Assiniboine, where the Wolseley neighborhood is now. Yeah, and it was around until I believe it was the 30s. It was from around the turn of the century until the 30s. It was there,
and it was just like a theme park.
Yeah, you know, imagine like the CNE or the PNE or any of those kind of. Like attractions. It was kind of the same idea. It was an amusement park that was that very typical kind of like, imagine a Midway and like a rickety wooden roller coaster, Ferris wheel, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and in the film it kind of plays as this whole sort of metaphor of the Winnipeggers' desire for this sort of idea of like happiness, but you know, falling into disrepair, and in the film, towards the end of the film, being trampled by bison.
Yes, yeah.
And destroyed and trampled by bison.
By a stampede of bison, yes, which is the provincial emblem, as well as a bison standing on a grassy
I didn't even put that together. Yeah. You're absolutely right. That's funny. So we kind of briefly talked about it. I mean, even though it's really striking and really impactful, him going on about the destruction of the arena and the Winnipeg Jets. I mean, let's be honest, neither of us are hockey guys. You know, it is really powerful. Like it really struck me when I first saw it, that scene, just walking away being like, wow, like you could tell his passion and his relationship to that building with his father growing up. And one of the more interesting parts of the entire film is actual footage of him going in mid-demolition to urinate in what is referred to as the trough.
The trough. No, the trough.
See, that's what I loved about watching it with you, because these little bits would come up and your reaction would be like, the trough!
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, the trough is a big deal?
Okay, the trough was... So, the old Winnipeg Arena, when it was built, instead of having an individual...
When was it built anyways? Like, how old was it?
I would have to say prior to the mid-60s.
Okay.
Maybe... I would say the latest it was built was 65, but it wasn't so old.
I just wondered, like, how historical the building actually was. Like, was it just nostalgia tied to it because that's just where... the local team played for a long time?
Well, it was not only that. It's like all kinds of events would come through there as well.
Yeah.
I went there to see concerts more than anything.
Yeah.
I mean...
well, like me, I never went to Maple Leaf Gardens to see a hockey game, but, you know, I saw, like, tons of bands there.
When it was put in, it was... the washrooms had... Instead of an individual urinal, it was just a stainless steel trough with like urinal pucks thrown in it and a drain at either end, right?
And how many people would this?
As many as you
if you could fit in there, you would all just jointly.
Well, that was exactly it, right? You could fit in like, let's say you could fit in 20 guys into there all at once. Just get them going through, right? And this would be right off the main concourse, so it's like you could grab a beer on your way out, go back to your seat, wait for that to go through you, and go back, right? So the trough, it was like a revolving door.
Interesting. And I know it's weird that we're talking about a giant mass urinal, but like he drives home the point that he films himself breaking in to be the last person to pee in this trough.
I will say this, that trough, going now to the MTS Center, which is where they built the new arena, which was on top of the old Eden's building. You go there for any event. I saw plenty of concerts there. I saw one of the first concerts there, which was the Tragically Hip. It was super Canadian. That's the most like Canadian sentence I think ever strung together. As I went to a hockey arena to see the Tragically Hip play. But you went to the washroom, and there was a lineup going out the men's room door, and then the chant started, "Bring back the trough." Since then, it doesn't matter what event you go to. If there is a lineup in the men's room at the MTS Center, somebody will start the chant, "Bring back the trough."
That's such a wonderful like regional detail.
Yeah, and then it was great. It had those those sinks where you didn't have to turn on the taps. You could like have the foot pedal to it.
I remember those in like shop class.
Yeah,
we had those like the foot pedal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
God, that's a weird memory coming back.
Now, see, I can't remember if that was in all of we're going back. It's been 20 years easy since I've been to the to the old Winnipeg Arena, but it was just efficient. They just packed everyone in like sardines, and it's like, go at her, just have it, right?
See, and like we both said, like we don't really care about hockey, but like you do have a lot of things to say about the arena. That's interesting. Yes. I mean, in the film, Guy Madden then goes on further because his father worked. Was it the Winnipeg Maroons?
Yes, Maroons. Yeah.
Which was an older hockey team before the Winnipeg Jets.
Yes.
I'm not a hockey guy. I don't know the history of these teams and when they joined and whatnot. I only know about the Winnipeg Jets leaving because of this film.
Right.
And that being a big deal. And you not being a hockey guy, but he talks about memories of being in the arena as a child. And this is what I find interesting about the balance. As much as he's creepy about the girls at the school and having this sort of thing for delinquent girls, and when he says girls, he's talking about girls that are like 13 years old.
Yeah, compared to him, which was like that's him when he's quite young.
He doesn't outright say I'm into these young girls. Like I don't want to put those words in his mouth, but there is a vibe there. There is very much a fetishistic vibe, especially when they go into the Winnipeg riots and they go into this whole sort of thing about the fathers protecting the school behind the barracks from the revolting Bolsheviks.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid that they're going to rape their like children, and kind of fetishistically talking about it. And that is balanced out by all these sort of homoerotic sort of dreamlike things of like being around these like naked Russian hockey players when he was younger and basically being like eye level to their groin when they were like he was like their towel boy.
Yeah.
And like fetishistically stealing their tunics and wearing them at home.
Yeah.
And like kind of like breathing in the scent of them. So like there's also this whole sort of weird sort of sexuality thing going on in the whole thing. That's the only other thing that I really wanted to bring up about the whole sort of the arena sequence. Is all of that stuff and the sort of bringing back all these dead Winnipeg hockey players for one final game as the things collapsing around him. And it is one of the longer parts. I mean, I think that goes on for about 15 minutes.
And what's his name who's in that is an actual hockey player too. I forget his name.
I forget.
I know they bring up things like Terry Sawchuk. Like my grandmother knew Terry Sawchuk because she was, the daughter of Ukrainian immigrants, and it was just like that was that part of Winnipeg, right?
Yeah.
That north end, that EK kind of East Kildonan things that like everyone kind of knew each other. Like I think for me, what makes this such an ideal Winnipeg movie is like, of course I know two people who are in it.
Yeah.
Like it's just that's Winnipeg. Everyone kind of knows everyone, despite the fact that it is a large city.
Yeah.
It's not huge by any stretch of the means, but it's still that's such a Winnipeg thing. And I like getting back to the homoeroticism. That brings up the whole point of the Golden Boy contest.
Yeah, I was going to ask because we've kind of focused on a few key things. If there were other aspects, little snippets of the film, because there's probably about a couple of dozen like set pieces that he kind of goes to about different things about Winnipeg, and we've only scratched the surface.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So I wanted to ask like what other ones jumped out to you.
No, definitely the whole Golden Boy sequence.
So briefly, just give a synopsis of that.
Oh, it's was it one of the mayors or ombudsman or alderman or something for the city?
Let me look that up because I love the name because of how they frame it. Because earlier on when they're talking about the history of the city, Mayor Cornish.
Okay.
The honest Mayor Cornish. And then I think they refer to him in the Golden Boy sequence as the former Honorable Mayor Cornish, who apparently was the last name of the first mayor of Winnipeg.
But that would have been back in like 1880.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's basically about
Whereas
him.
this takes place in more like in the 30s or 40s, gathering from it. Where
So the Golden Boy pageants, because the Golden Boy
he's on top of the legislature.
It is is it of Hermes?
Yeah, I believe it's Hermes, and he's facing north, carrying a shaft of wheat and carrying a torch.
It's a gold statue, and I mean, even I have, when I was there, a souvenir pin of the Golden Boy.
Oh yeah, I have one on my denim vest.
Yeah. And but it's also the name of these pageants that they would hold in the Bay Building.
Yes, it was at the Paddle Wheel Diner, which used to be on the second to top floor.
So for people that don't know, the Hudson's Bay Company, it is a Canadian institution. It goes back to fur trappers.
Yes.
But is a department store chain in Canada, which
recently
like all over the world,
there.
department stores are going the way of the dodo, but the Bay is still around, and it was generally, no matter where you live,
historically, it was
even if you lived in a city, there was a big
Winnipeg.
downtown Bay building.
Yeah.
Like every town in Canada has a Bay building.
Yes, and it was headquartered in Winnipeg historically.
Yeah.
Up until very recently.
So they had this
shockingly recently.
So they had this restaurant called the Paddle Wheel Restaurant, which basically was like, it was like a cafeteria?
Yeah, yes. It was basically a cafeteria style restaurant. That was called the Paddle Wheel because the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, especially the Assiniboine, has a fluctuation of its silty bottom. They are great ways to get around the prairies quickly, but like most rivers in that part of the world, and famously in the States, it would require a paddle wheel, so it would have a low draft to the vessel, and it just kind of skims the surface. So it had, in honor of those early paddle wheels, like initially the best way to get around the province was by boat.
Yeah.
For
which
hundreds of years.
I would never think of, because you think of the prairies, right?
Yeah, but it's like the rivers network, and then having Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg had steamers up until very recently.
Yeah.
Like there's still like, there's still a Coast Guard station on Lake Winnipeg, which is pretty funny because of course there is, right?
Yeah.
So the paddle wheel was in homage to these early steamers, and so it had
this giant fountain paddle wheel in the middle of this restaurant turning.
And you could go, and I remember like going with my grandmother and my mom and my sister. We'd go there like during the day when we were off school in the summer, and like throw coins in there and have like, I forget what they even served there, but I remember having Jello for dessert. I had Jello for dessert. Yeah, I remember that.
So in the context of the film, though, this is where the mayor kind of had his downfall, because there would be these Golden Boy pageants, which are male beauty pageants.
Yes.
The mayor's up there solicitously measuring their chests and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And he ends up being brought down politically because a lot of these Golden Boy contestants got cushy government jobs.
Yes.
And they don't go into too much detail. It's a relatively short segment, really, like maybe only like 4 or 5 minutes.
Yes.
But that's the context of that. And any other scenes stick out to you?
Well, I just think funny thing about that is, if I recall correct, Glenn Murray was one of the first gay mayors in Canada.
I can't speak to that. That's interesting.
And he would have been voted in 1999. And 1999 isn't that long ago, but it's long enough ago that being openly gay could tank your career.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I believe, if I understand correctly, Glenn Murray was. So that was just interesting to me. It was interesting that he painted a gay mayor so, like you said, solicitously, right, in that context when Canada was home to, one of the first gay mayors of a major city.
That's interesting. That's something I know. That's a kind of cool thing to bring up. Not cool, but you know what I mean. Well, I mean, I think the only other sequence, until we talk about the end and the entire structure of the movie, just because I think it's a fascinating piece of history. Well, actually, two things. Now that I think about it, I want to go into the Winnipeg General Strike, because in our nation, it is an important, not just for Winnipeg, but for our nation, and in some of the sources that I research, in the world for the labor movement and unions. Day, what is it called? If Day. Sorry, I want to talk about that because that is something that is real, that is bonkers. So can you touch upon two of those, and then we can just pick and choose if there's anything else that we want to bring up. But.
The idea of the Winnipeg General Strike was that you had an entire workforce that came back from the First World War and kind of bought into it, for lack of a better term. They bought into the idea that it's like, okay, well, we just won what was at that time the most destructive conflict in history in terms of like material and like loss of life. that they're like, okay, well, yeah, things are going to be better now. They came back and it wasn't. So you look at an entire generation of people that really kind of banded together for this. We're talking on the home front, on the actual military front, and someone was still making a buck off them, right? Like capitalism didn't disappear because of this. And looking at what had happened recently in Russia at that time, which was in the throes of a civil war, because there was a revolution there. There was kind of this worker state coming into fruition. And
an almost international fear of something like that happening anywhere. That was going on the world over.
You have to understand that in 1919, Canada was fighting in Russia with the White Army against the Red Russians, like the Bolsheviks.
Were we really?
Yes.
You're more of a history guy than I am.
Yes.
Like, I know my bits of history. Canadians fought in the Russian Revolution in an official capacity?
In official capacity, yeah. Look at
I had no idea.
The Siberian Expeditionary Force and the, like, what was it around Murmansk? It was up in northern Russia. I forget the name of that expeditionary force. Interestingly enough, it was Royal Canadian Artillery and the Northwest Mounted Police.
That's crazy. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, that whole truth about, well, they say in the film Winnipeggers not knowing their own history, and, you know, rather infamously, Canadians know of ourselves that we are not up on, you know, I'm not a dummy when it comes to history, but, you know, like, definitely there are areas where it's lacking. Yeah. But, like, the Winnipeg General Strike is a perfect example. Before I saw this movie, I had no idea about this.
Right.
And what was it? It was like 20% of the workforce in the city went on strike?
What happened was...
I could be wrong with that number. That's just what's floating in my brain.
There was a walkout, but it was a very coordinated walkout, and that just led to mass protests and more walkouts. And
it was mainly just for, like, wages, workers' rights,
yes,
conditions, you would expect.
That, yes. Yeah, it was kind of...
and it went on for a long time.
Yeah, it went on for some weeks, if I recall correctly. Around this time of year, it would have been May into June.
Okay.
Which is dicey in Winnipeg because you could have a day where it's 30 above and then a frost warning the next day.
But this grinds the city to the halt to the extent that they have to bring the military in?
Well, that was the problem, is that most of the military was basically gutted then because of demobilization from the war. Most of the strikers were former military because of the end of the First World War. So the military was found to be not really that useful. But the RCMP was. And that famously led to a charge by the RCMP on horseback to kind of break up the crowds, because it was at the point where, like, streetcars could get through and the city ground to a halt.
Yeah.
The state of emergency was declared,
and this got international attention.
Yes.
You know, this was big news at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it led to other smaller strikes around the country as well.
Well, when I was reading up on this, you know, the Winnipeg General Strike itself was considered a failure.
Yes.
Because the RCMP was called in, the workers went back home to generally the same, if not worse, conditions. But around the world, it was considered a success because it got these sort of conversations about labor practices, looking at how that one went down, and it's considered, in terms of world labor and unionization, a sort of milestone.
Yes. So
this is a factual thing that I think is interesting in the film, because it does create this discussion, and it's something that I learned. So there is an educational aspect of it. How do you think about, like, how they portray it in terms of, like, the animation and stuff like that? Again, it's truncated into, like, a 5-minute thing. It's not very long.
No, that's when I say,
like, he does take the strikes and then decide to tie it into fetishization of young girls as well.
Yeah, well, I think Guy Madden really gets his Prince Ahmed by going into
that's a really good comparison. Yeah,
like, because there's a lot of that. There's a lot of kind of that backlit, like, silhouette style animation in this, and I think that goes back to his general aesthetic, right, of kind of like silent film and even just like pre-color film, and how much that kind of affects his aesthetic sensibilities.
Yeah, I do like the Prince Ahmed comparison, because of course if he's going to have an animation style, he's going to be using the influence of, is it the oldest feature length animated film? One of them, anyway.
It's one of them, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those funny things, like with anything historical, it's like what do you take away from it, you know, 100 years later? And that's hard. Does he do it justice? I don't know. I don't think the point is to do it justice. The point is to have that be a reflection of what he thinks of Winnipeg. Right?
And, Winnipeg being a very sort of working class city.
It's a notoriously, there's a labor temple in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of, very left-leaning people that came there, especially from Eastern Europe. I mean, my family included, right?
Yeah.
Famously, my great-grandfather came over because he would bomb trains in what was formerly Russia.
Well, so yeah, and as I said, I want to talk about If Day, because If Day is another thing. That was one of the things when I first saw it, I thought I was going to go home and look up, and it was going to just not be a thing that actually happened.
If Day was a thing, yeah.
Okay, so what is If Day? This little segment, one of the more memorable segments portrayed in the film.
If Day was a war bond drive put on by, I believe it was the Kiwanis or someone in Winnipeg, or the Kinsmen or someone like that. It was a local, voluntary organization, and their whole thing was we're going to bring up war bond drives, and this was during the Second World War, and they dressed up as the Wehrmacht, and they took over, quote unquote, Winnipeg.
Yeah, they got the outfits imported from Hollywood.
From Hollywood, yes, yeah. And they dressed up like they were Germans and went around asking for ID papers and arrested the premier and the mayor and all this.
And as we stated, this is one that he couldn't get that much archival footage.
No, now famously, people thought that this was just stupid when it happened.
This is what I find. You brought this up off mic before.
Yeah.
And I find this fascinating because the film kind of portrays it as, afterwards sales of war bonds went up. It kind of portrays it as a successful thing, but it wasn't.
Well, it was I mean...
It's a bonkers thing, don't get me wrong. I'm just wondering.
No, it's one of those things, it's we know. That's why we're putting in 80 hours a week in a factory, or, sending our children off to fight in Europe. Yes, we're well aware, thank you.
Because this was during the war. This wasn't one of those things before Canada's involvement. I mean, we were in their ground zero. It's not like the States said it took a while to get in.
No, this was in 42 or 43 or something.
Because I didn't even think about that, how insensitive that would be going around. And if you're, a Winnipeg mother with kids off, being bombed.
By the time that happened, I mean, members of my family were already dead, from fighting in Europe. People knew what was happening.
Yeah.
You didn't have to wake up and remind them.
I mean, this film isn't trying to be an objective documentary.
No, it's not.
And it's fascinating that he throws that in there as something that did actually happen.
Yes.
Well,
because that's the thing. So it's part of that. It's part of the Winnipeg kind of mythology. That's the thing, and that's why I don't. It's to look at any work of art as a historic document that is actually historical. I think that's why when Guy Madden said that he didn't want to make a documentary because it's too much work, it's well, of course, because then people are going to hold you to a standard of historical objectivity and reality, and I don't blame him. I wouldn't want to do that.
Do you think you end up with a lot more interesting film than you would if you just had a straight up A to B documentary about Winnipeg?
Of course. Yeah.
Do you think it in a way says more about Winnipeg?
It says more about Winnipeg. Definitely, I think it says more about Guy Madden than it does Winnipeg.
Yes,
and I think that's really the point. It's I wouldn't. That would be like writing a song that's
Let's talk about the end then, right? Because finish your point about the song, but.
Well, my thing is it would be like writing a song about an objective pop song about the actual pheromonal reactions that happen in the human body during love. That's boring. No one wants to hear that.
Yeah.
But that's not the point. That doesn't say anything new. That's the point of art. Is that it's not. Guy Madden made a fantastic work of art. He did not want to make something that was going to be used for study, and I don't blame him for that because he's an artist. He's not an educator.
So let's talk about the end of the film then, because we're talking about this being more about Guy Madden and less about Winnipeg. At the end of it, it goes back into this sort of feverish, sort of dreamlike thing, amazingly edited. Some of the editing sequences, I mean, we haven't really talked about the actual structure of the film at all. It has a very interesting score. Like I said, it was shot on a lot of different mediums, but the way that they're edited together, and if people don't know, Guy Madden's kind of known for his editing.
Yeah.
I believe you can see it on YouTube. One of his most famous and one of my most favorite things that Guy Maddin has ever done is called The Heart of the World, which is just an amazing feat of editing. It's like a 3.5-minute, 4-minute short film. Self-contained story, very Guy Maddin, but is just absolutely incredible. And, there's nothing as flashy as End of the World here, but Guy Maddin is still doing his unique sort of editing tricks. There are editing techniques that are basically, considered to be his creations now, that other people now adopt and use. Now, the end kind of goes into this sort of fever dream and comes up with this idea of a page 3 girl for a local paper. There's a specific,
I believe, yes.
Yeah, something like that. But instead of a page 3 girl, and page 3 girls are probably still a thing. I don't know. I remember them when I worked in factories when I was a kid. Yeah. And people would have from the Toronto Sun the page 3 girl posted in the rigs and stuff like that.
Winnipeg Sun had
so I don't know if they still do that. I would like to think they don't, but they probably fucking do. But he envisions a page 3 girl for Winnipeg, and this page 3 girl is Citizen Girl.
I love Citizen Girl.
I kind of have a crush on Citizen Girl.
Citizen Girl's great.
Because Citizen Girl is a very upright, proper, almost looks to be wearing sort of Russian revolutionary uniform.
Oh, it has Sergei Eisenstein written all over it. It's a very, very Soviet agitprop kind of character.
And the point of Citizen Girl is that Citizen Girl is going to look over Winnipeg. So finally freeing him to be able to leave, because now Citizen Girl is here, and Citizen Girl will reverse all the wrongs. She will rebuild the torn down Eden's building, which we didn't really get into, but it's the same as the arena. It's just he gets upset because an old building, a landmark, got destroyed in Winnipeg.
Yes.
But he rebuilds the arena, and all these hockey players can come back to play. And it's sort of this rising crescendo of everything that I have a problem with Winnipeg will be fixed by this Citizen Girl. And it all kind of culminates, which we didn't talk about, which is the mother then, the final time you see Savage playing the mother, cradling his brother who died when he was younger, committed suicide, having this very touching conversation with them, and kind of ending with a photograph of actual real photographs of Guy Maddin and his family, and Guy Maddin asleep on a couch as a child.
Right.
And it kind of brings this whole thing full circle of the dreamlike quality of it, that you see him sleeping as a child at the end, at the beginning of this journey that we will see literally mapped out through the entire film psychologically.
Yeah.
Do you think that's fair?
I think it's fair. I think the one thing, another thing that points to it being Guy Maddin's Winnipeg and not a look at Winnipeg, that this just dawned on me. Everyone in this, even Citizen Girl, even everyone walking down the street, it's a very white film, whereas Winnipeg is not a very white city. It still is majority white, but for a city that, aside from historical shots of indigenous people at the beginning of the film, it's for a city that has the largest urban indigenous population in Canada, there's nothing there. And I think that points towards it being Guy Maddin's Winnipeg, and the Winnipeg of the early 60s more so than it is Winnipeg as it is today, which is
very little is contemporary about this. The only thing that comes close to the destruction of the arena. Yeah.
Which is already...
But that goes back to what I was saying about, his home is a time.
Is the time, yes.
As much as it is a physical place, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that just ties into it more.
I think the only other thing to pull out is the pool scene.
Right, yeah.
Because the whole movie, and I'm only bringing this up because it has my favorite line of this film. Because yours was a meatloaf line. Yeah. But this movie is obsessed with layers, specifically layers of 3.
Yes. And layers of water for that matter, too.
Yeah, and this swimming pool, which was a real swimming pool, what was the name of it?
It's the Sherbrooke Pool, I think.
Is it still operational?
Not in that capacity.
Well, no, it was in real life. It's just an Olympic-sized swimming pool that was built in Winnipeg back in the 50s or something, around there. Enough that it was around when Guy Maddin was a kid. But he reimagines, because this isn't true, I believe, that there are 2 swimming pools underneath.
Right.
And he, in his story, the main swimming pool is for girls. The second one is for families, and the bottom one is for boys.
Yeah, it was something like
that. But he has memories as a boy going down there, and again, this leads into the young impressions of sexuality of other naked boys running around and they're urinating on each other.
Yeah.
And he's just like, why can't we just swim?
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like that sometimes. Not that people are peeing on me, but it's like when people are just like being ridiculous and you're like, can't we just have nice things?
Yeah.
Can't we just enjoy? And every time I leave this, every so often I'll just think to myself, why can't we just swim?
Yeah.
And that's
Fair.
my one big
Absolutely
takeaway.
fair.
What would Spencer's Winnipeg look like? What would you focus on?
I would show more than just one season. That's my big.
That really was a bee in your bonnet about this movie.
Because that's everyone's like, oh, Winterpeg. It's like it's hotter there. Like I've been in Winnipeg when it's been one of the
Arguably,
hottest
though,
places.
people not from Canada, like Americans, say it about the whole fucking country.
Oh, I know, but for people who are like, what amazes me about this country is how hot it can get, and like we just never talk about that. We're always like, oh, it's so cold.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a wider range of like, yeah, it's very cold here, but we're continental. It gets very hot as well.
Yeah.
No, my Winnipeg would be a different time. It would be some of the same buildings, some of the different buildings, and I like Winnipeg. You have to understand that Winnipeg, as it is now, is an amalgamation of 13 villages, towns, municipalities, and cities. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's not. That's even going back before that. Like my dad's from St. James, and my mom's from Charleswood, and like now that's the city of Winnipeg. But you have to remember, there was a time when it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like the difference between like Halifax and Dartmouth. Now it's like the Halifax regional municipality, whereas there was a time when it was different. It was split up. It's like, you know, it's more like the Brampton and Toronto thing, except now it's just not. Now imagine that Brampton is just Toronto and considered part of Toronto.
Yeah, when I was a kid, you would still have to drive through some fields and open places to get to Toronto, but that's not the case anymore.
Not the case, yeah.
Okay, so as I usually end the show, I mean, I usually ask what this film says about Canada.
There's nation building and mythologizing all over the place, and this is the same but different. It's mythologizing, and it's like a personal building thing. It's Guy Madden building himself up and building up his history. I think that says something about Canada in general. Is that like you could, as much as this is a regional and very like personal thing, you could have a My Canada thing as well. For some people, there would be no difference. I know people who grew up in places like Toronto who are like, oh, I was amazed when I found out we weren't America, you know? And for some people, that's true. I remember talking to some kids at school and they're like, well, like, yeah, we're part of America in like grade 3. And it's like, are you like, dumb?
Are you serious?
Oh yeah, for sure.
That's crazy.
They just don't have an idea of like a national identity. I'm not saying that's a good thing or it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's, you know, it's a thing.
Yeah. So overall, glad you watched it. Glad I made you watch it.
Oh yeah.
Got another Guy Madden under the belt.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm looking forward to doing more Guy Madden films. I'm not quite sure which one I would want to do next, but I'd really like to do one on Careful. I think that's my favorite Guy Madden film.
All right.
What do you have a favorite?
No, Guy Madden's he's such a mixed bag, and it's like, as much as he has a style, he's kind of like Lynch in the sense that like all of his movies are like just different enough.
Yeah.
You know, that it's like, oh yeah, I wouldn't say that I do.
Fair enough. Okay, well on that note, thanks for doing this. Hope it turns out.
Yeah.
All right. North of Normal is a product of Eldritch Creative, which can be found on Facebook at Eldritch Creative and Instagram at eldritch.creative. This show can be found at North of Normal on Facebook and on Instagram at North of Normal Pod. Intro music is by Dad vs. Son out of Hamilton, Ontario. That's it for now. Be safe.